Now it says we've started recording. Let's see if it tells me I'm starting online. It should. Offline. There it is. It's online. Okay. Now I will speak to all of you who aren't there because everyone in this class is sitting in front of me, but I know it's important that we record this. And I'm going to put this on camera right now. I'll come back in a few minutes to the other thing. Well, I won't need to do it. Yeah, I need to do it right away. Come think of it. Where? There it is. I can't see. The little green light come on. Is that on?
Yes.
I'm thinking if you're going to put them up there, you ought to put something, make that light a little bit more distinctive so you don't have to be blind to find it. Yeah, all right. And yeah, it ought to work. I made the right choice here. Let me do this. Tonight we're going to study Panasonic, a Japanese electronics firm that came on strong in the late 1950s, early 1960s. All right. This, since we are live, or we are recording at the moment, I'll just pass on. This is BL472 or BL612. E for evening. You have the syllabus is available online, and we will be following this. With a one sort of exception, which is I have at week 7, and I realized I was thinking, well, week 7 will be the last week of the semester, and I think what I was thinking when I set it up was we would lose spring break, but this particular course allows for spring break, so we have an extra week that I need to fill in, but that's all right. You'll be happy to have more time. Pardon me. All right, there we go. It's coming up. I don't know how well it'll hold. How much? Well, they're seeing it. Not they. If you look at the recording, you'll see it differently. All right. What I handed out as a translation aid, I'll explain that when we get to it. Let's have a word of prayer and get started. Okay. Maybe we want to. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Whoa. They've also lowered these cameras, which I keep feeling like I ought to point out. Doctor, I have this molar that's bothering me, but I think you could see it. It's so close. But anyway, let's have a word of prayer. Father, you chose to reveal what you had to say in the Old Testament using the Hebrew language. And you have preserved knowledge of that language and the ability of us to read it, analyze it, exegete it, and apply it to this day. And we thank you for that. And we realize that if that's true, then you had a purpose. Help us, therefore, tonight and throughout this semester to take advantage of this wonderful blessing that you've given us, to be able to read your word in the original language, to have more certainty in our interpretation and understanding, and therefore a better basis and a more secure basis for our application, our lives, and our ministries. Help me to be clear. I'm tired and sort of distracted at this point. Help me to get my focus and to get through this course, and particularly this class session, this evening's classes, making myself clear, and above all, helping these students to learn what they need to know, preparing them for the life that you have and the ministry that you have for them in the future. Again, thank you, Father, for giving me the privilege of teaching this class. Thank you for allowing them to learn. Now give them something to learn, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. I want to, I'll leave that alone. So that's probably, I want to check something. There's this. These have a nasty habit of not working. Let's see if this one does. It does! Okay, so I don't have to. Can I get it to go backwards now? It's supposed to be going backwards. There it is. Okay, and I'll kill it for the moment. All right. I mentioned when I was blithering on, not making much sense earlier, that we're going to be looking at various approaches. Now, one, you have two textbooks, and you have them both there. One is a standard Hebrew syntax book, Williams Hebrew Syntax, 3rd edition. I used the 1st edition when I was in seminary back in the 1970s. Williams now is dead, and his book has been re-edited and revised by another author now. But the point is, it's been around a while, and it's very, very useful. But as I hope to demonstrate this semester, or this cycle, I guess I should say, this course, it's limited. It limits itself to how, its concept of syntax is limited to how words function within words and phrases and clauses function within a sentence. Beyond the sentence, and this has been around for ever since the time of Aristotle, beyond the sentence was considered the realm of style. Not of language per se, and not of grammar. Now, in the late 1960s, really the early 1970s and into the there was a shift within Old Testament studies. They made the discovery of a very liberal theologian, a guy with terribly liberal theology, and I use the word terribly intentionally. A German fellow, he discovered that there were parallels between the Old Testament literature, particularly in the Psalms, and songs and psalms from Mesopotamia and then other places. And he said, oh, there's a pattern here. And there are literary forms. And so this gave birth to your other book, which, there it goes, pull it out, there we go. Cracking Old Testament Codes, and what's its subtitle? Did you read it?
Where is this subtitle?
Oh, yeah, I think you have to look on the first page. I mean, on the inside the book.
Oh, okay.
I think it has a subtitle, doesn't it? No?
Oh, no.
Keep turning. Anyway, it deals with what's called form criticism or literature criticism. It's saying that there are literary forms. Does it have a subtitle there? No? No. I thought it did. Well, that teaches me a lot. Okay. What do I know? And that has a tremendous advantage because it says there's something bigger than the sentence. It says we're looking at the whole discourse, or not, they wouldn't use the word discourse, the whole literary piece, whole piece of literature, a whole psalm, a whole book, a whole story. And that's very useful. The problem with it is twofold. Number one, the approach sort of starts with the idea, well, we're going to find out how this particular literary form works by comparing literature from parallel cultures, from other cultures in the Middle East, normally, and that worked out very well with the Psalms. And then they said, well, it probably works otherwise, but we don't have other literature. We don't have that much narrative literature except poetic literature that doesn't parallel the Bible. But we do see patterns in the Bible, so we'll define those as literary forms. So they're inventing their literary forms, not discovering them. And the second thing is they define those literary forms in terms not just of their form, but of their content. And they say certain values have to be in this to be, and the result is it becomes pretty subjective at times. Now that doesn't mean it's useless, it just means we need to be careful when we're using it. So those are the two that I've given you. You're going to read those. I'll give you specific assignments, and we'll go over some of this material in class later. The general Hebrew syntax book is just a wonderful way to kind of get back into the swing of it. If you weren't, for example, reviewing and preparing for this class, this would be a way to kind of give you a sense of how Hebrew works again. But what I want to introduce you to tonight, and which we'll be dealing with pretty much all through the semester, is something called discourse analysis. And I'm looking at a specific kind of discourse analysis. And I in years past, when I taught this course, I actually assigned this as a textbook, and I realized I shouldn't. This is a textbook or a book that was written by linguists for linguists, and they take a lot of things for granted. And in order to get the benefits of this textbook, you have to already have some familiarity with linguistics. And that means you're learning, and it's not dealing with Hebrew particularly, it's dealing with language. And that means you have like 3 different bits of learning you have to do to make benefit of the book. So forget that. I will be your translator now, and I will pick and choose what's there. And if it makes you feel any better, this is what I'm using in writing my doctoral dissertation. So getting it clear to you will help me too. So this would be a good thing for us. All right, let me just give you some background here. 1952, that's as early as we can go. A fellow by the name of Zelig Harris coined the term discourse analysis. In his view, it was more of a literary thing, or I should say a semantic thing. It was about meaning. And he says that you understand how sentences go together. It says sentences don't operate independently. They are part of a bigger group. But he didn't deal with it as a grammatical fact. He dealt with it as as I said, semantic, a matter of meaning. So you would trace the meaning of sentences and paragraphs to see how the meaning worked. That's not what we're going to be doing here, but it's the background to what we're doing. It turns out that Zelig Harris was the mentor and primary teacher of Robert E. Longacre, who is the basic author of this book and the originator of the theory that's found in the book. The crucial thing was he said maybe grammarians, including the concept of meaning in their analysis, should look at something bigger than the individual sentence. And to be honest, which you'll find in many grammars of most languages, including Hebrew, in fact almost all Hebrew grammars that I'm aware of, and syntax books too, is they just have sample sentences. Sometimes they construct their sentences. And they say, here, there it is. And if you remember your last class with me, how frustrated I would get at times when there would be a sentence and he would say, this is being used this way. And I said, well, you can't know that without a context. Mm-hmm. And they didn't give us any context. So the fact that you translate it that way gives the impression that somehow it's free for all. You can just decide to translate any way you want to. And Harris said, no, we have to go beyond that. It was not until 1970 that we have the beginnings of what the kind of discourse analysis in the technical sense that I'm looking at here. In this class, I'm going to make you listen to and put up with all course long. In a journal called Foundations of Language, a fellow by the name of J. Laureate published a paper with the help of B. Hullenbach called Scipio Paragraph Structure. And you go, why do I care? Scipio is a language of a South American tribe. And the answer is, why should I care about South American tribes, and what has that got to do with this? The point was, it was the first time he discovered something. He discovered that certain forms and constructions and words could only be explained in terms of the paragraph that they were in, not in terms of the sentence. And that if you didn't understand that, they were totally obscure. And Hebrew has terms like that too. We'll come to Dr. Longacre called them mystery particles that he says exist in every language. Words I had the impression that English isn't your first language. Am I correct, sir?
No, my first language is Mandarin.
Mandarin, yeah. So when you come to it to learn English, wow, it's not just Mandarin, with an English accent, is it? And you can't just translate the words. I know, because I've had Chinese students in my class before who are still struggling. And what I really enjoy is the definite article. There's no telling where it'll show up because They don't have definite articles in Mandarin.
No.
And so it's a very hard concept for them to accept unless somebody has studied linguistics and can explain the logic of it. That's still not make it easy, but at least they can figure out what's going on. And most Americans don't have any clue why we use the definite article in one place or another. We just do. It's obvious. Anybody can do it. But then there are English terms, and I don't know any that might, because I don't know Chinese. I mean, don't know Mandarin. I shouldn't say Chinese. There are dozens of different Chinese languages, but the Mandarin.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about Mandarin, except what I've learned indirectly through reading and stuff. But I'm sure that there are terms and phrases and and little words in English that we use all the time, and you go, what does that mean? And the truth is, it doesn't exactly mean. And yet it's important that it's there. And that's what he's talking about. That's what he found out in Scipio. And he says the secret is to look at a bigger unit beyond the sentence. And it began the study, and this was done through, I guess this was Summer Institute in Linguistics, the folks from Wycliffe. And so once he presented this, other South American translators began looking in their languages and discovering it was helpful. And Robert Longacre was reviewing their work as part of his role, because he'd been a translator with SIL before he went into the University of Texas at Arlington, where he spent his career in education. And he came to the conclusion, you know what? This is true in all languages. All languages, the grammar, the sentence grammar, the stuff that's in our little Williams Hebrew syntax, that works, but only up to a point. If we're going to really understand what's being said, we have to go beyond that. And so he's doing something of the same thing beginning in the 1950s. I know it says 1970 was when this was published, but the thing he published actually bounced around in SIL studies for about 10 years before they got it published. And so I guess it would be actually the 1960s that he started publishing, and then in the 70s really went to town on this. Let's take a look at the bigger picture. So on the one hand, we have form criticism, which says there are literary forms that are reliable and helpful in helping us to understand what the author is doing. And then there is now discourse analysis, which says the same sort of thing. But they're not the same. Form criticism focuses on, first of all, a set form of literature, not of language. And it tends to focus on individual authors' usage rather than on language usage. Whereas discourse analysis, because it was originally designed not as an exegetical tool for Old Testament studies or New Testament studies, both of which it's made inroads into, but it was originally established as a guide and a help to. See, I never turned it on, did I? Might as well do that. As a guide and a help to the understanding of how languages that had never been recorded before, never had a written form, how they worked, because these translators are having to go in and learn a language from scratch and then turn it into a written form and translate the Bible into that language. And they found that often when they did that, they would write things that they thought made perfect sense and the people thought were hilariously wrong. And so they were desperate to find ways to make it better, and this was helpful. This was incredibly helpful. And then Longacre, who was himself seminary trained, started saying, if it's true for these native languages, it should also be true for Greek and Hebrew. And he wrote articles demonstrating its function in both. Now, here's kind of the mantra of his whole view. I'm looking like it's high, but it's right over my shoulder here. Language is language only in context. Now, let me see. Did I set this up right or not? If we're going to record it, we might as well record it right. No, I don't. We need to go there. Now it's right. So when you look it up now, that will be on the screen separately, not just in faded form on the board. Language is language only in context. And that is wonderful because it fits exactly with our perspective here on this campus as to how to interpret the Bible. We see the secret here we're looking, well, let me just look. What are the advantages of this approach? Let's try this, see if I can't make it work. Now, there are two, when I call them theoretical advantages, I'm not saying, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. I'm saying that in the theory in Longacre's theory, there are these advantages. They have the right, what I would say is the right basis and the right goal. The basis is the discourse as a whole. He doesn't take a sentence and rip it bleeding from its context and say this means this, and then we take another sentence, this means that, and then try to figure out how to put them together somehow. He says, no, we must do it the other way. We must understand the whole in order to understand the parts. And then he turns around and says, and we must understand the parts in order to really appreciate the whole. In other words, it's a cyclical process. I'm constantly going around and around looking at the big picture and the little picture, or as they say in linguistics, top down and bottom up. And this is exactly what we want to do, you know. This is the reason that when we teach homiletics on this campus and we talk about how to come up with a sermon topic, message, what is the core idea of your message, of your sermon, one of the things we're going to say is, look, you don't just grab a verse and preach the verse. You can preach that verse if you can, but you first have to consider its meaning in the broader context, the whole of the Bible, or in the whole of the book, or the whole of the chapter, or the whole of the paragraph that it's in. You can't just grab it and make it mean what you want it to mean, which is exactly what happens if we don't consider context. More than that, so there's our discourse, there's our context. And remember, Longacre said it's the context that makes language language. Up to that point, it's just a bunch of words. Also, he and others would say, language doesn't just occur, or sentences don't occur in isolation. They clump together. And if you don't see how they fit together, you don't see what's being said. The goal is also exactly the goal we want to have on this campus. Notice, the author's intended meaning. It is presuppositional to this whole approach because they've been dealing with languages, and say you're down in a tribal region in South America or somewhere in Central Asia or something. You have a tribal language no Westerner at least has ever learned or ever written down. It has no written form. And you start trying to find out, how about this, what the people really mean. And they look at you like you're crazy. What do you mean? My language doesn't mean a dozen different possible things. It means what I said it means. When I tell you I want to get an oar, I mean get me an oar. I don't mean, I wonder what it really means. No, don't go there. So they start off with this idea, since normal use of language is always the author who decides what the language means, therefore the goal of the language is always to get inside the author's head. Now the critics of this approach always say, but no one could get into somebody else's head. We can't understand that. We can't read somebody else's mind. It's impossible. And if that's what we were talking about, that would be true. But notice, we get the author's intended meaning by the hints, by the helps that the author gives us, as revealed through the choices he made when he composed his text. The argument here, and again, a little saying that was repeated again and again in pretty much everything that Longacre ever wrote on discourse analysis, is that there is no such thing as random choice in language. You can say things any way you want to, and it doesn't really matter. And the answer is no, that doesn't work. It turns out that every choice we make makes a difference. Now I'm going to jump ahead in my notes here a little bit. There we go. If you're an American, and you're not, so this wouldn't be as familiar with you, but you probably heard in school, in high school, a statement made by, I gotta think of his name, first name, but Payne, in common sense, it starts this way. These are the times that try men's souls. And he's describing the time just before, or the time of the American Revolution, calling for everybody to support the American Revolution and freedom from England, separation from England, back in the 1760s or 1770s. These are the times that try men's souls. Okay. E.B. White, a great American writer, looked at that and he said, there are other ways of saying that. Times like these try men's souls. How trying it is to live in times like these. These are trying times for men's souls. And my favorite, soul-wise, these are trying times. Now, the interesting thing is he was talking about style and how we can, how a good writer, he was writing a book on how to write, and he was talking about how a good writer knows his style. And he says you have to develop a sense of what's the best style for you. And he goes on to say that while these are the times that try men's souls is a little lengthy and roundabout compared to the others, it's the best way. He considered it style, and he considered style something of a mystery that good writers just kind of figure out. Oh, it's Thomas Paine. I have it right here. It seems unlikely that Thomas Paine, he makes this quote though. He says, it seems unlikely that Thomas Paine could have made his sentiment stick if he had couched it in any of these other forms. He says, it's the way he worded it made it work, which means Thomas Paine arranged his sentence in order to set the stage for what followed so that people would not only read it but agree with him in his overall pamphlet, not just in that sentence. It was a choice he made, and if he had made other choices, it wouldn't have worked. And that's what you'll find if you read writers talking about something. They'll say, it doesn't work. I remember hearing an interview with Robert Frost, the poet, who was talking about stopping by woods on a snowy evening, one of his most famous poems. And at one point, he has the statement, my little horse must think it queer to stop along the roadside drear, to watch the woods fill up with snow. Now, in an early draft, he had written, the steaming teen must think it queer to stop along this the roadway here to watch the woods fill up with snow. And he scratched that out and made it my little horse. And somebody asked him, why did you change it? And he says, it just felt right. Yeah, it just felt right. But literary critics have said the other doesn't work because he is talking about how isolated he is. If he's got himself 2 or 4 big old horses there, it's not the same as having one little horse there. He made a choice, and he did it on purpose, and it made a difference, even though he didn't know why he made that choice. And it's important that we recognize that choice when interpreting what he said. And that's the biggest thing these are the 2 great advantages that I see in discourse analysis. It really sets the stage for understanding clearly what's going on. And of course, from our theological point of view, it's perfect because it says, since every word of Scripture is inspired, and we say, and it turns out, it's not just theologically significant, it's semantic. It makes a difference in meaning and interpretation. Not necessarily a dramatic change in meaning, but it's there for a reason, and it's the author's choice that makes the difference. All right, those are theoretical advantages. Let's talk about what are the benefits, particularly the practical benefits, the specific benefits that we get from taking this approach. And this is all theoretical, setting the stage for stuff that we'll look at as we develop through the course. I don't expect you to understand it yet, but at least you can get it written down and know what's coming and see if I can pull it off later by proving it. All right, there are some other things. I have a list of 8, but I think for our purposes I will just live with 5 things that can be accounted for. The first are intersentential connectives. I wish I could come up with a better word than intersentential, but I know. As I said, traditional grammar says all syntax and grammar occur within the sentence or smaller. No, but they also include words that connect sentences, like the word therefore. And therefore, for example, in the book of Romans, I have Romans chapter 1:18 through the end of chapter 11. And then I have a therefore. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God. That therefore is not limited to the sentence. That therefore connects the entire rest of the book with the entire former portion of the book. And traditional grammar just mentions that therefore has expresses result or expresses consequence, and it's but it doesn't point out the fact that almost never is that therefore within the sentence. It's almost always between sentences or between paragraphs or between whole huge sections of what people have to say. And other such connectives exist. Phrases like when you're speaking, you say, you make a summary, says so-and-so says this, and so-and-so says this, and so-and-so says this. Be that as it may, well, what is it? You may not be familiar. There's one of those things that probably doesn't sound like, it doesn't have a corresponding thought in Mandarin, but what is he saying? He's saying, okay, here's what other people say, and I'm giving them a certain amount of credit, but there's something more to be said. And I just said all that with be that as it may. And you all know, okay, I finished talking about other people's point of view. Now I'm talking about my point of view. And I'm saying that my point of view isn't in total disagreement with them, but is in partial agreement, but also believes that there's more to it. And I got away with that with a connective that cannot be explained by grammar, by traditional grammar, by sentence grammar. You have to look at the bigger picture. And when you do start looking at the bigger picture, you start finding that there are syntactical rules that govern these bigger constructions too. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this course. So intersentential connections, that is link connectives, that is things that connect sentences together or paragraphs together, things that are above the sentence level together. Mm-hmm. Here's one, variations in word order. This is because English and most European languages have a rather strict word order. So that if I'm speaking, when I'm speaking English, which I am, I just noticed, which is the only language I really speak, so I better be speaking English, otherwise I'm just gibbering. But when we use English, our normal word order, unless there's something going on, is subject and then predicate. I say, he says, the book is on the table. I don't say, I can say, on the table is the book. And in a poem I could get away with that, or if there was some other contextual reason, I can rearrange the order of words, but normally I wouldn't. But you all have had Hebrew 1 and 2. You already know Hebrew doesn't have such a strict word order. And yet, Hebrew, like Latin and Greek, because I remember when I took Latin in college and Greek in seminary, they would say that they don't have a set word order. And yet, as I translated them, I realized that there was a more or less standard word order in Latin and Greek, a normal one that would happen. And then every once in a while, it would be different. And so while I can say omnia Gallia in tres partes ista visa, or ista visa omnia Gallia in tres partes, or I can say in tres partes, I can rearrange them all sorts of ways. The order in which Caesar said it, all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, is the one that would normally and naturally occur to most Romans, at least according to the literature we have. And yet say, okay, so everybody kind of falls into a standard word order, even in languages that don't have a requirement that you have your subject first or second. So why change? Oh, for variety, or, but my favorite, for emphasis. But that's a dodge. For emphasis is a real dodge. Because what they really mean is, it's unusual which is the reason I'm asking, why did they do it? And they say, they did it so they could be unusual. Well, why they wanted to be unusual? Shut up. You know, they don't want to talk about that. They don't talk about that because they think that by putting a label on something, a label is the same thing as an explanation. But once they take the bigger picture, they start noticing that there was a logic to the way sentences, sentences, yes, in different languages arrange their word order. Hebrew, Greek, these languages in tribal languages, I suspect, some languages are different than others, but I suspect even in Mandarin, notice I'm speaking for ignorance, but I'll bet that you can say the same thing in 2 or 3 different ways in Mandarin.
Yes.
And I'll bet if you really stopped and figured it out, there's a reason you use one in one place and another in another place. It just, like I say, if you're a native speaker, you just do it automatically because you're used to it. But it makes a difference. My favorite, and it's not really a word order thing, but it gives the same idea, is 2 words in English, or 2, I don't know whether to call them words or not, 2 phrases. One is uh-huh and yes. I think I may have mentioned this in class last year. But everybody, I can remember, uh-huh and yes are just 2 ways of saying the same thing. Uh-huh is informal and yes is formal. Only it turns out that's really not quite true. I mean, it is, uh-huh is an informal way of talking. You would never write it in anything because unless you're writing dialogue and you want to have somebody say uh-huh. But if you're on a telephone with a native speaker of English, now this is one of the ways we all figure out that people aren't native speakers. They may have incredible, seriously, they may have incredible pronunciation. They may get the words just right. But they'll say things that we would never say, or in a way that we would never say them. And we don't know why they don't work, because they are perfectly fine, and they're even grammatically correct, but they seem odd. And it's because they're things, our context has an effect, even our social context. You're on the phone, and somebody's just talking to you, rambling on and on and on, and you're going, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And uh-huh means, yes, I'm listening. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm agreeing, but I'm listening, I've got it, I've heard what you said, I've heard what you said, I've heard what you said. And then if you go, yes, the other person will stop and wait for you to say something. Because uh-huh means, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm hearing you, I'm hearing you, I'm hearing you. Yes says, I'm hearing you, I want to say something. It's how we use language. And variations in word order are very often that way. One of the most common ways in all languages, including English, is you change the word order in order to keep something topical. I'm talking about something, this is one of the things English teachers go crazy trying to teach students in high school, particularly, and probably in English comp here at Calvary too. Say something like, the world is a better place because John is in it. Or maybe his eulogy. The world is a better place because John was here. And now he's gone. After his death, and whether you realize or not, I just interrupted the flow of thought. I'm talking about John. He's gone. After his death says, I'm starting a new thought about what happened after John died. I'm not talking about John anymore. By rearranging the sentence, instead of putting, he was this and this until he died, by changing that, I notify everybody, all right, I'm finished with that, I'm ready to go on. Now what happens is, if you're trying to write for your teacher, you'll stick these sentences together and they won't work, because you'll jump from John to after his death and his mother and his brother and then back to John again, and you go, and the reader is going, or the listener is bouncing around, what? No, we have to, a good writer, a good speaker moves through and he signals to the reader / listener what's coming and where things are going. And one of the most common ways is through word order change. Moving something to the front of the sentence so we can know this is either to say I'm about to start a new topic, or to say I'm continuing the same topic even though the subject of the sentence has changed. I'm still talking about John here. Oh, one of the most common ways we do this is things like, John, his wife is a good friend of mine. See, that way I'm still talking about John, but I need to make a comment about his wife. But if I say, John's wife is a good friend of mine, of my wife's, people say, well, now, are you starting to talk about, have we finished talking about John, now you're talking about his wife? He said, no, I'm just adding another piece of information, but it's not really directly about John, but it's relevant to the topic. Therefore, I put John at the first of the sentence, even though it's not grammatically associated with anything else. His wife is a friend of mine is the complete sentence. John's just sitting there saying, that dangling word at the beginning is there to say the topic is still John, or the topic of what's coming is John. One of the things I find most interesting is how we use pronouns, which is not the same thing as variation in word order, but it's similar. How about this? After his death, after he took the throne, Augustus became even more significant in Roman history. Or, after Augustus took the throne, he became more. And the difference is interesting. If I say after Augustus took the throne, then I'm not talking about Augustus. I'm talking about what happened at the time that Augustus took the throne. If I say after he, I'm talking about Augustus, and I'm just locating Augustus in time, the portion of time. It's that kind of stuff that only is available if we pay attention to the broader context. And the only system I know that takes a look at that is discourse analysis. And this is called holistic discourse analysis. I'll explain why in a moment. Let me just move on. Another thing, and we'll take a break and I'll come back and we'll talk about discourse type. I talked about literary forms. A literary form, for example, if when we look at poetry in your textbook, they'll talk about the Hebrew Psalms of Lament, Hebrew Psalms of what I call descriptive praise and declarative praise, that is, Psalms of praise and thanksgiving. And they'll say each of these have their own form. And in this case, they're right. There's a nice poetic form, much like in English, if you want to write a sonnet, a Shakespearean sonnet, then you're going to have 3 quatrains followed by a heroic couplet. And they're all going to be in iambic pentameter meter. And I don't understand poetry in Asia, but I know they have very, very strict rules for the design for certain kinds of poems. You have to have it just so. And it's like, yes, that happens, and that's wonderful. The trouble is finding what is a poetic or a literary form and what is a linguistic form. So that when I, for example, write on Proverbs 1 through 9, they'll say, well, look, there's in Proverbs 1 through 9, we have if, then, if this is the situation, then imperative, do this, because of this, in order to accomplish this. They say, there's a pattern. That's a literary pattern. That's a literary form called the instruction genre. And that's what you find. Genre is the big word that you stole it from the French. And but the problem is that same form occurs in the Law of Moses, which is not instruction genre. That's legal genre. And the answer is, wait a minute, it has the same basic structure. Oh, it's all different because this is about law and this is about advice. And the answer is, but it's using the same. Oh, no, it's totally. The point is, they let the literary form is not really a literary form. It's actually a language form. It's hortatory structure. This is how, when somebody wants to give instruction, wants to give orders, tell people something to do, there's a certain facts that that always appear in whatever language and in whatever literary form you're dealing with. Many of the Psalms have a hortatory structure at the beginning, the Psalms of praise. You know? Hallelujah, praise ye the Lord. And then it says, why? Because he's great, because he's good. So praise the Lord. And that's the same basic construction as do this. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, so do it. And a father giving instruction to his son, the law telling us what we ought to do, and the psalmist calling upon us to praise God, all use the same linguistic pattern. The same, I will steal the term, discourse pattern. Because it's the same discourse type, even though it might be, poetry and prose are different literary forms, but they can use the same syntactical, or I should say, discourse patterns. And that's the crucial point here. Let's see, I have something I've been missing that I should have been telling you. I've got constituent order, yeah. This is a paper I wrote a while back, and it's focused on Romans, so not so much about Hebrew. As I said, we'll talk about what goes into a discourse type and how to identify discourse type, and we'll look at the basic 4 discourse types that are true in all languages. Because it turns out human beings are human beings. We all tell stories and give instructions and explain how things are done and describe things. And lo and behold, another thing is variation in verb forms. Now this can be kind of important in some cases. As we will see tonight in Hebrew narrative and Hebrew stories, most cases, there are a couple of exceptions we won't worry about, but in most cases, you're going to have the Vav consecutive preterite. Wayikto, if you want, that Vav consecutive preterite. You say, wow, why? That's just what they do. And it turns out all languages have a standard form you use when telling a story, standard verb form or predicate form. And it will vary, not every language has the same. In English, we use the past tense for a lot of different things, so they don't notice it. But we say, oh, well, it's in the past tense because it's in the past. But of course, the present tense doesn't deal with the present in English. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. When we talk about something in the present, we don't use the present tense. We use what's called the present progressive, a participial form. I am sitting here. If I say I sit here, this is a good example of a foreign person coming to the United States and learning English. Oh, it's the present tense. Say, I sit here now. And everyone in the room says, oh, he's from another country. He speaks another language. Because we would never say that. And he was tricked because we called it the present tense. But it doesn't deal with the present. If I can say, I sit in this chair, every American, and Englishman too, everyone who speaks English as a native language will say, oh, that's where he normally sits. So I'm coming to class and you're sitting in this seat, I'll say, hey, I sit in this chair. This is my standard sitting position. Because that's what the present is normally used for in English, is what is consistently going on. That's why we use it so often in Proverbs, in English. A stitch in time saves 9. Not is saving 9 right now, but it will. That's a standard procedure. It's what's normal. And the past tense, the same way. We use the past tense for a variety of uses, but because we speak English, we don't notice it. And we call it a past tense, so we assume, oh, that's all there is to it. But in English, you tell it in the past. He found out that native tribes throughout the world, they also have a standard form that they use to trace the major events, the major action of a story. It may not be the central point of the story. The story may pivot on dialogue, for example, or on persons involved. But the basic outline, or how do I want to put it? The basic skeleton of the story is based on a certain verb form. And in Hebrew, that verb form, as I said, is the Vav consecutive preterite. You may recall last year I had you, when we were in, I think it was in Genesis chapter, not Genesis, it was Genesis chapter 22, the offer of offering up Isaac as as a sacrifice. And I had you go through and highlight all the Vav consecutive forms, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And then you go, oh, there's the basic flow of the story. These are the major events in the story. But then there were interruptions in that story, you know. Abraham, the Lord appeared to Abraham, and then Abraham arose early in the morning, and he let's see if I can get it right. He arose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and he took his son and he took two servants and his son, and he set out. Boom, 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 all of that Vav consecutive. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And then we have, on the third day, wait a minute, we just interrupted that flow. And of course we interrupted that flow. We just skipped over 2 full days. There's a reason why he changed. And on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and it's not a Vav consecutive preterite. It is a perfect. And you go, oh, he's marking, by the change, he marks something. But if I limit myself to the sentence, I can say, well, both occurred in the past tense, so there's just 2 ways of saying something happened in the past. But it's not quite true if we look at the bigger picture. There's a reason the author chose to change his verb form. And this is huge, because there are really 2 major issues when it comes to interpreting language. One is verbs, and the other is nouns. And nouns are about who and what is involved, and verbs are about what's happening. And that leaves the thing, participant reference. Again, language marks the beginning and end, marks the beginning and introduction of a new person, for example, into a story. Once upon a time, there were 3 bears. Remember that? There's the mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear. And I smile and laugh. But if you go to the book of Ruth, you'll find out that in the days when the judges judged, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem, Judah, went to the plains of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was, he said, hey, wait, this is once upon a time there was, and his name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Machlon and Kilion. He's setting the stage. And later we are introduced to Orpah and Ruth, and there's a way that's done. It's not, and then this happened, and this happened, and they married. And then the father died, and then the wife and the mother and Naomi was left without her husband, and then Machlon and Kilion married 2, and then again another Machlon and Kilion, the sons of Naomi, married 2 Moabite women. The name, and now we pause and stop. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth, and you go, oh, when I have a new feature. And then I love this when I teach the book of Ruth. When we get to chapter 4, we have a very interesting situation. And it just, for the person who's reading the Hebrew text and is used to reading Hebrew narrative, even the rest of the book of Ruth, this just jumps out at you. He starts off and says that Boaz, of course, is waiting at the city gate to talk to the nearer kinsman. And he says, and the man, the nearer kinsman that he is looking for, came. And he says, hey, such an one. Now, he uses a Hebrew term that means basically, what's his name? And you go, there is no way that Boaz does not know the name of the man he's speaking to, and there is no way the person telling the story doesn't know the name. The Jews were very good at keeping track of their genealogies all the way back. If you don't believe me, spend a glorious morning reading through the first 9 chapters of the book of First Chronicles. So and so begot so and so, begot so and so, and you got these. Just pronouncing the names will keep you up at night. They keep track of this because it's very important to keep track of their family. Oh, such and when you say, wait a minute, why isn't he giving us the name? I know Ruth, I know Orpah, I know Naomi, I know Boaz. I even know Machlon and Gilion. But I'm not given the name of this nearer kinsman. And not only am I not given the name, he goes out of his way to not give me the name. And so when I'm interpreting this chapter, I have to stop. This is crucial to me because there are people saying things. Well, the man doesn't marry Ruth. And I don't think we can be negative. If he might have had a perfectly good reason for not marrying Ruth. He was married, he didn't, and it wasn't, and there's nothing there. And I'm going, but the author told me that this man was not a good man. He doesn't want to give him credit for even giving his name. And when we read the story, it makes sense. He says, I will, how does he word it? He initially says, I'll take the land, I'll buy the land, because I'm going to double my holdings. I'll become twice as rich as I am now. And then he says, oh good, when you buy the land, you get Ruth also. And he goes, whoa, hold on. I can't do that. It might endanger my inheritance. Do you realize that raising up a seed for Machlon means that land will never be mine? I will be responsible for working it every year, paying people to go out there and plow it and everything else, but that will never be my land, and the money I get from that will have to be held back to give to this son who will never be called my son, so that when he gets of age, he will have all that wealth to help him get started in his own family and continue the line of Elimelech. And he says, I'm not going to take that kind of a risk. Do you know how much money that could cost me? And then we put that in contrast. There's Boaz, and he says, I'll do it. He's taking the same risk, but he didn't care because he's doing the right thing. And yeah, participant reference. By not giving us the name, by giving us that word, that crazy little word in Hebrew, the author sets us up to understand. All right, those are all the things. When we come back, we'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk about how to identify a discourse type and what it is. But that's enough. I've run you forever and ever. We'll pick this up again, then we'll actually look at some Hebrew before we're done tonight. Yeah. Seems like a good idea in a Hebrew reading class. All right, I know I just turned it off, but you can get it when you come back. All right, now I have to do this. you're back. And as I promised, let's talk about identifying discourse type. And you'll see there I have two parameters. Longacre actually has 4 parameters that he uses for subdividing literature, different kinds of literature. And I may introduce some of them in the future. But for tonight, let's just look at the 4 basic categories. And that's by 2 different parameters, 2 different sets of guidelines. One is contingent succession. Or actually he says contingent temporal succession, but I don't know, in other words, you have events placed in order of their occurrence. First this, then this, then this. And somehow, in some way or another, the second is dependent on the first, and the third is dependent on the second and the first. And that's as in a story. Abraham arose early, and he saddled his donkey, and he packed. Well, those are the events not only happened in that order, but there was he rose early, and he couldn't have saddled his donkey before he got out of bed. He could do other things besides saddle his donkey, but that saddling the donkey depended on the fact that he was out of bed. And while he might have been able to do something before saddling his donkey, yet he's splitting the wood so he can pack it on the donkey's back, and he's so one by one, all of these things are not only succession in normal order, they're also contingent in some sense. They depend on one another. A good example of this is comparing Genesis 12, about the call of Abraham. Abraham is called, the Lord calls Abraham, and then Abraham goes down into Egypt. And down in Egypt, he gets into some trouble, and the Lord bails him out, and he comes back from Egypt, and he builds an altar. And all those things, each one leads to the next. He couldn't have gotten in trouble in Egypt until he actually got down there, and he had to leave the land. And the fact that he left was a problem because God had told him he was going to give him the land. And so all of those things work together in a sequence. And so you have contingent succession. On the other hand, in Hebrews 11, all the various heroes of faith are in chronological order. But they're not contingent. I don't say, Abel was a hero of faith, Enoch was a hero of faith, Noah was a hero of faith. Those are the first 3. But I can't say that, Enoch's faith was somehow connected to Abel's faith, other than the fact that they both were people of faith. In other words, that's a list of people of faith given in chronological order. So we're not just talking about chronology, not just talking about temporal succession. It has to be contingent temporal succession. And he says, and all use of language can be divided into 2 groups. There's language that presents material as happening this, and then this, and then this. And there's language that doesn't. And the second of the 2 parameters is what he calls agent orientation. And this is very, in some ways, easier to even understand. This is whether or not the language focuses on the doer of the action or on the action itself or its effects. It's easy to illustrate. It's the difference between Mary baked a cake using 1 egg or Mary's cake used 1 egg. In one case, I'm focusing on the person doing the baking of the cake. In the other, I'm focusing on the cake. One has agent orientation, a doer orientation, the other doesn't. And those square boxes, in the upper left, you have plus plus. When something has both agent orientation and contingent succession, it's narrative. It tells a story. Stories are about people doing something, and their actions unfold in a series. Now, there's more that goes on in a good narrative. There's structure that we'll later talk about, maybe even tonight. But that's the essence of narrative. That's the two crucial things. Now, it can be further subdivided into future narrative and past narrative, so that I can look in the prophecies of the Old Testament and find descriptions of how things are going to be in the future, as well as hearing about events that happened in the past. But in both cases, you have contingent succession and agent orientation. Now, if I have contingent succession but no agent orientation, so here, the one on the right, the column on the right is lacking agent orientation. The column on the top is plus contingent succession, and bottom is lacking it. So I say, okay, if I'm telling us something in a series of events, but I'm not focusing on the person doing it, what am I doing? Well, the classic example of this is a recipe. It's called procedural discourse. And I can, again, that can be past tense or future tense. I can do something like past tense. I can say, this is, every once in a while, get the History Channel or something, it'll tell you about how the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. And they'll say, well, they started with this, and then they did this, and they did this. But he's not focusing on who did it. He's focusing on the events themselves. So it's not agent-oriented. We're not talking about the Egyptians or the ancient Egyptians or the Egyptian slaves. We're talking about the building of a pyramid. And that would be procedural discourse. It has contingent succession, but it lacks agent orientation. Okay? Then we have, what if it has has contingent succession, but doesn't have agent orientation? And this is what Longeher calls behavioral. The most common way of expressing this is hortatory. This is where I'm telling you, you need to do this and this and this. And I'm not focusing on the agent, I'm focusing on the agent. You need to do this, but I'm not necessarily telling you a series of events. I can say things like, if I'm talking to my children when they were still living at home, I can say, before I get home, I need your room to be cleaned, the living room to be vacuumed, and the front yard to be mowed. But they can do that in any order they want. That's agent orientation. I'm focusing on what they're going to do, but I'm not telling them an order to do it. And most commands are that way. Although there are sequential, but they're not contingent in most cases when we talk about this kind of thing. Another thing that can be used is if we look, those are looking to the future. If I'm looking to the past, then we have a eulogy. And I just give a long series of what he did. What a great man he was. He did this and he did that and did that. He isn't necessarily focusing on I'm not focusing on contingent succession. I'm focusing on what this guy did and what made him so wonderful. And then, what if I don't have either? What if I don't have contingent succession or agent orientation? Now, I have exposition. That is, or expository literature or expository discourse. In an expository literature and exposition, it works very simply. I'm describing. I can describe how things are. One of the clearest examples of this in the Bible are in certain Psalms. I mentioned we have behavioral discourse, which you have a command, basically hortatory. Praise ye the Lord, praise, O ye servants of the Lord, praise the name of the Lord, Psalm 115. But then we get because. Now that's the reason, but the reason is almost always expository literature, because this is what God is, this is what God does. Not what God has done in his story, not what God will do, those can happen, but most often it's, let me just tell you what kind of God he is. And I'm describing God to you. He is God, and the classic, as you will discover, is God is great and God is good. And almost all the Psalms of declarative or descriptive praise basically have those two characteristics. There's something about how awesome God is and how personally God can be trusted because he cares. And you can't have praise without both of those, because if God is just awesome, then we've got Allah. We live in fear of him, but we can't love him because there's no relationship. But if he's just love, then we have the God of most American, non-Christian Americans, which is, he's a God who just loves, but he has absolutely nothing he can do for me. And he's a teddy bear. I can get warm hugs. I can feel warm and hug, but he's useless as far as life is concerned. But if we have both, then we have a God worthy of praise, and we have a reason, a motive for praise. And so we have exposition is very common in that kind of literature. And so there we go. Those are the four basic discourse types that Longacre identified, and we're going to be looking at them. As you notice, I don't know if you can see it here. I think I put it in your thing here. Yeah. Tonight we're going to be looking at narrative literature, and we'll talk about that. And I'm not going to go into it because it's the most common and most familiar. It's the stories. I mean, it's most familiar to us all. The nice thing about it is there has never been a culture on earth that anyone has ever discovered where storytelling isn't a very important part of that culture. I mean, it seems to be storytelling and giving orders are the two most basic things that humans do with language. And so you're already familiar with stories and how they work, even though you never analyzed it in a scholarly way, but you have a gut sense that, are you familiar with the phrase gut sense? A visceral sense of how it works. And so, and the result is people understand these Bible stories get the gist of it very nicely once they get into them. Mm-hmm. The problem is we tend to have in America the idea that somehow stories are really for children. And we write off the stories as, those are, for Sunday school for kids under the age of 12. And instead of going back and looking and seeing what's really going on and how important they are. Next week we'll be talking about legal literature, the law. We'll go to Exodus chapter 21. And we'll see how that's structured, and we'll see how the language works, and it will fit in there too. Legal literature is basically behavioral. As I said, he subdivides further, and I might help you with that, but basically it's a very behavioral. This is how you should behave. Usually in these in Exodus 21, it is, in this situation, behave this way. And if the situation changes, then this is how your response will change, that sort of thing. And then we'll spend a couple of weeks in poetic literature. We will look particularly at one of the great Psalms, Psalm 51, a psalm of confession. And we will see that although it's great poetry, it also fits neatly on that pattern right there. When he confesses his sin, what does he do? Expository. He describes his sin. If we were to compare if we were to look at the parallel psalm, which we may just for the fun of it, in Psalm 32, we would see that he gives a little narrative. He says, "Listen, when I kept silent, my bones waxed old," and he spells it all out. And how it happened. So we get a little bit of a narrative in there. Then after that, we will shift over to wisdom literature. My kind of love story here is with wisdom literature, and we'll be looking at Proverbs 16, which is a very interesting passage of Scripture, and one of the few places in Scripture where in Proverbs, where we have a theme. The first 10 verses, or first 9 verses of Proverbs 16 are about the Lord, and especially about his sovereignty for the most part, and also the last verse of the chapter. And then we have a series of verses that are about the king and right relationships, being the right kind of king and having the right relationship with the king. So we'll have some fun with that. And we'll end the semester, or end the course, and I guess it will be the end of the semester. Well, technically our semester doesn't end until July 1st, but we won't worry about it. We'll end our last two classes, we'll be looking at prophetic literature, which will be Ezekiel 37, which is a fun one. This is the vision of the dry bones and Ezekiel joining two sticks together into one. So I think you'll have fun with that. And in every case, we'll be able to chart it here and say, okay, and because we can put it here, it creates certain expectations. Now, in most cases, we already have those expectations because we have this kind of literature in our own language too. So once we recognize what we've got, we're already kind of halfway down the road. The trouble is, different languages do things differently. And so what I would, for example, in English has to use a lot of pronouns because our verbs don't have the subject in them. Mm-hmm. So I can't say run, fall, or I should say ran, fell, got away. And have you know that I'm talking about this, you would assume somebody ran and fell and then got away, but I could be talking about how he ran and fell, but he didn't, but somebody else got away. The policeman was chasing him and he fell and he couldn't, and so the other guy got away. And so I'd have to say he did this and she did that and so forth, so you know who I'm talking about. We use pronouns a lot, and pronouns in English usually refer to things that are really to participants who are already established in the context. The classic again. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Red Riding Hood. She lived in a house near a great wood, a big woods, or near the deep woods. Maybe I should put it that way. I can't say, once upon a time, she lived near the deep woods. And there was a girl named Red Riding Hood, because it sounds like I'm talking about two different people. No, I have to start off by establishing who Red Riding Hood is, then I can use the pronoun. Now that's true pretty much for all languages. The difference is, when I say she, if I have the personal pronoun there, it's like, well, that's the only way I can say it. In Hebrew, the normal thing would be to have a verb that doesn't have an express subject other than in the verb form. Because it will tell me whether she is a third feminine singular. I'm still talking about what she says. And of course, I think I mentioned this last year at some point. In Song of Solomon, we have a series where he's talking to her and she's talking to him. And the Hebrew, and almost all the English translation will say Solomon Shulamite, or something. It'll try to identify the speaker. And it looks like, wow, they just arbitrarily started deciding who said what. And the answer is no. The Hebrew makes it very clear. One's a man, one's a woman. But we don't have any way in English to do that. You are, for me, the fun one is, what was it, the song? What a friend we have in Jesus. There's a saying, he's the lily of the valley. If you read the Hebrew, lily of the valley is feminine. It's she who is the lily of the valley. And by the way, a lily was a wildflower, common wildflower. And she says, I'm the lily of the valley. I'm just a dandelion. I'm just a common flower that grows everywhere. There's nothing special about me. And then her beloved says, if you're a dandelion, all other women are thorns. I mean, boy, that's a winner. You know, you want to impress a girl. Say that. That's a good one. But the point is, we know that because we know Hebrew. If you just read the English, you either don't know it or you have to take it for granted that the translator got it right, or that the English text got it right. And obviously, some people misunderstood and assumed that the lily of the valley, which they first of all thought was a lily, like an Easter lily, something precious and beautiful, and it must be a reference to Solomon, or to what they see as to Jesus, because they always tend to make that a figure for Christ, and the result is they totally misrepresent the text because they didn't let the text guide them. And this is one way of figuring out where we're going, and we can watch how these various things work. All right, well, nothing else seems to be there.
Guess it's time to go home.
No. Now it's time to dig in. Open your Bibles to Genesis 38. Let's talk about narrative, and I will go to the trouble of bringing Genesis 38 up. Spare you the process of having to watch. Oh, that one. Here it's good. Two of those in here. Yeah. Hopefully I didn't double check this. Hopefully I got it right. Yeah, so good. We have the text. That's all. Every once in a while I forget to save the Hebrew fonts with the file. It'll come up, and on my screen it's beautiful. In my office I come into class and it'll be a bunch of English letters all looking disastrous. But here we go. All right, let's bring that up to here. All right. And now I'll put this back down. There we go. And if somebody were watching, they would see it now on their thing at home. Okay. I know this is a little small, but you have your Hebrew Bible in front of you, so we're good. And I hope you brought a lexicon, your lexicon too. That would be helpful. Let's see. I'm thinking I'm like you. I started going to the wrong direction. What's wrong with it?
Oh,
I should know that no, I know better. I just wasn't paying attention. I'm not.
It makes
I'm
you feel
smart.
a little better,
I
though.
know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm the teacher. I know what I'm doing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. You're not buying it for a second. I got
Nope.
it. All right. All right. I'll have it there in case I don't need it, and I have my lexicon. If you don't have one, here we can play with it. All right. Here's an interesting situation. For the most part, I told you that the normal pattern, and let's see, I hope this is just light enough I can get away with this. Yeah, that'll work. Because I don't want to. That's sandpaper. Let's see if this one works. I don't want to do it. All right. See, here we go. There's a vowel consecutive verb. There's a vowel consecutive verb. There's a vowel consecutive verb. And there's a vowel consecutive verb. Okay, let's take a look at this now. What is interesting, however, is I did mark this one. And it is a vowel consecutive verb. That's the verb to be. And it was. And the problem with that verb, to be, and there are certain other verbs too, is they're not action verbs. So when I say the verb consecutive is the mark of the main line of a narrative, of what's sometimes called the storyline, or the backbone of the narrative, I'm talking about verb consecutive verbs that are the verb consecutive form of verbs that are action verbs, where the subject is doing something. Remember, I started to point to it. It's not there anymore. But remember, in narrative, you have to have agent orientation as well as contingent succession. Well, the verb to be is a state It doesn't describe action. And while it may refer to, and in this case, it doesn't even have an agent. Look at what it says. Wahi ba'et hahi. And by the way, we're in the Genesis, we have a frustration. For some reason, when they want to put the feminine verb, a feminine pronoun, third feminine singular pronoun, they use the vav, not the yod in there. And it's so that's he, which is right, hahi. So it was, and it was at that time, eight being a feminine, and this is with a hey on the end, the definite article is what I'm trying to say. It marks this as a kind of pseudo-relative pronoun, that time, and it was at that time. And you say, okay, that's setting, and that also suggests that we are at the beginning of something. This is, we don't usually start a sentence, and it was at that time, when we mean we're just, I met my wife at a camp in the summer of 1970, and I wrote to her every day, and it was at that time, and you go, oh, now we're going to phase 2 of the story. I can't, that's not the next thing that happened. So this is the start of the story, a phase in the story. And then we have the story proper begin with these action verbs. Yared, yat, wayet, which is the verb natah. And here we have wayer, the verb ra'ah, to see. So we have it was at that time. And so here is setting. I believe I handed out to you last year, or provided for you, a thing about the narrative pattern. I talked about a boy who wanted to be a dog whisperer, and I explained how it worked. But setting is one of the first things that happens in a story, or in a phase of a story, or an episode in a story. And so we're starting at something. And so that's why I did Genesis 38. It's a story in itself. As I said, we won't finish it tonight, but we can play with it anyway. All right. It was at that time. What happened? Wayered Yehuda me'et et echau. And there's another. And I know two things. Here we go. Let's start here. Here's the first sentence. I know that, first of all, I've got one verb, and now here's another verb. So this is a clause. And in Hebrew, it's useful, especially in Hebrew narrative, to consider every independent clause to be a sentence. There can be dependent clauses attached to it, but if you start saying, oh, this is a compound, the idea of a compound, or a compound sentence in English, this and this and this, well, then you have entire books that are just this and 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 this. So we're going to treat it that way. So I have the verb, and then I have verb, subject, and then further clarification here. And more than that, what's the word I want? The scribes here, the Masoretes have helped us with disjunctive accents. Here we go. That's a disjunctive accent, and that's a major disjunctive accent. And that's a major disjunctive accent that always occurs along with the end of verse marker. Now, there's some other disjunctive accents, but those are the big ones. So I said, and it was at this time. And yared. Does anybody remember the vocabulary word yared?
Came down or went down?
Went down. Very good. And went down Judah, me'et, which is from with his brothers. Notice it's a plural. Ow, his, and then we have with a patak here, so this is the plural. Achim. So, and Joseph went down with his brothers. We can't say that in English without sounding weird, but he says he was with his brothers and he went away from them. When Joseph went down from his brothers, the idea being his brothers were up in the mountains and Judah went down. His brother, and of course, being everybody but Joseph, who was presumably, it's not quite clear, but it says it was during that time, and the story that what we just ended with in chapter 37 was Joseph being sold into slavery. And it seems to be it was about that time that Judah went down from his brothers. Why yet ad ish adulami. Oh, I should put it there. There's an end of a sentence. Ushmo hira. All right. What does the verb natah mean? He natad unto a man, an Adulamite man. Remember, Iran is populated by Iranis. Iraq by Iraqis. Israel by Israelis. Adullam, the city of Adullam, is populated by Adulamites. This is a gentilic suffix on the end here. This is a person, a man of Adullam, or we would say the Adulamite. And we know, and his name was Hira. And you say, I recognize that. That's background information. That's part of the setting. Yet, I think you have your form there. Did I give it to you? I don't remember where I did or not. Yeah.
To turn?
Huh?
To turn?
Yeah. And he turned unto, or up to, an Adulamite man, and his name was Hira. Now, Hira, if you want, is Hira on the accent. Hira, last syllable stressed. And you say, okay, most translations say to Adulamite named Hira, which is normal English usage. But Hebrew normally says this as a separate clause. Parenthetical clause. And his name was Hira. Vayer Sham Yehuda Bat Ish Kanani Ushmo Shua. Let's go there. And there's another, and I'll do it this way. I'll put those in brackets so you can see, and his name, and so forth. We go along here, and we're down here. All right. Now watch this place. And Judah. Now, this is important. We have already established that Judah is the subject. Judah went down and he turned aside to a Adulamite, and his name was Hira. So why do I have Judah again? And the answer is because it's important that I distinguish what Judah does from what Hira does. Mm-hmm. Could be that I'm going to tell you some more about Hira. And he says, no. And Judah saw there the daughter of a Canaanite. There's Ka-na-ani, E again, Canaanite man. And interesting, very interesting. Ushmo, Shua. Name Shua. Who was named Shua? The daughter or the father?
Father?
Huh?
Father?
Yeah, what is that pronoun?
It's masculine.
Yeah, it's the third masculine. And his name was Shua. Pardon me. Where did I get it? Yeah. And here's the.
Tough one.
I got another. There we go. That's
was
the
a
one.
little
I got another.
confused
This is also
first. I was
his name, but I'll get to his name in a moment. But that's different. And his name was Shua. It's interesting. Later, he will talk about the woman in this chapter. The focus of this chapter is on how the tribe of Judah was survived, because he kept having sons drop dead because the Lord was not pleased with him. And if it weren't for his daughter-in-law Tamar tricking him into thinking she was a prostitute, there would have been no tribe of Judah. She had 2 children, and all the tribe of Judah is descended from those 2 sons that she had, the twins that she gave birth to. And that's the point, is that, again, and his name was Shua, and that's interesting because the author is not telling, the logical thing is he's going to marry this woman. He saw this woman, and so he said, oh, the woman is the subject. And he says, no, woman's irrelevant, and I can prove it. I'm not even going to tell you her name. I'm going to tell you the name of the Canaanite man. I'm not going to tell you the name of his wife. And he never does. Because he says, I want you to be clear. The focus is not on the woman he married. And this is really important when you're doing exposition. When you're going to preach or teach this lesson, you're going to say, I need to keep my focus on Judah and not the woman. Because they say, because there's a whole realm now of Old Testament theology that's called feminist theology. It says we need to interpret the Bible in light of the women, and they'll come to this passage and say we need to read this passage in the light of this Canaanite woman that he married, and say what does it mean to her and everything else. And the answer is there's a term for that. That's fiction. You're making it up. The text doesn't give us that information. It may be there's a very important bit of information there, but it's not the information God gave us. So if you want to write fiction, but call it fiction. Don't say you're explaining the Bible when you're inventing it. And this is not a slur at the feminists, because men do it all the time too. I've irritated my own pastor at times. He was doing, he was doing one of the Gospels. He was preaching us through one of the Gospels. And then but week after week he would say, well, Mark doesn't talk about this, doesn't tell us the rest of the story, so let's go to Luke, and then I got to show you something from John. And I'm going, wait a minute. You're not teaching us what Mark said. You're teaching us the life of Christ. Mark had a point in telling the details he did and not telling the details he didn't. And the idea is, but I need to fill in the picture. And the answer is, no, we don't. And then, of course, the ones I really hate, and I've even heard this in chapel on occasion, somebody say, it could be that the reason he did this was because he really was a racist. I mean, talking about something in the Bible, he really had a racial prejudice. That may be what's happening here. And then, by the end of the sermon, he's talking about, this is what racial prejudice does to you. He said, you invented racial prejudice. You didn't find it there. And it was something that was maybe when you started, and now somehow it's for sure. Let's let the Bible speak. There's plenty of good stuff there, and enough to beat up racial prejudice or whatever else. It's all in there, but you have to see what the Bible itself actually says. Okay, we got to what? We got Canaanite, and his name was Shua. Now, interesting here, very interesting. Why Yekaheha, and he, it's clearly he, from the verb lakach, and he took her, and he went in unto her. Now, this is a technical phrase. Bo el, a woman, her, or the name of a woman. That is marriage, or I should say that's sex. That's sexual action. And so this therefore is marriage. He married her and he had sex with her. And you say, okay, and notice, that does work. The sequence, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Because you can say, okay, He went down from his brothers, and he turned aside. That is, he was on the road, and he stopped and spent some time with this Adulamite named Hira. And while he was there, he saw the daughter of a Canaanite, and he married her, and he had sex with her. In all that is, and then this happened, and it's contingent. He's not likely to marry a woman if he didn't even know she existed. And he's not likely to have had sex with a woman if he had never left with a woman near the Adulamite, if he'd never gone to, if he never left his brothers. Everything is in a necessary order. Things are linked together. All right, that gets us, you don't mind if I clear some of this green off of here, do you? So I can move on. We're into... Now, all of this is, up to this point, really, has been sort of setting the stage, because we're just going on and on. Now we have a very interesting change. And it becomes really significant in the fact that he never told us the name of this woman, right? The author has left her name out. And watch. Wa tahar waitelid bain. And she conceived, and she bore a son. Now we know who it is. It's this woman he married, who so far is only all we know is she's the daughter of a Canaanite man. Otherwise, she's she. This is really. Now, if you're really antsy about it, you say, "Wow, they had no respect for women." That may be true to some extent, and that the women didn't have the status they had today. But that's not the point that's happening here. What's happening here is the author's telling us, look, the important thing is the sons. I don't want you getting sidetracked with the woman. She's a necessary part of the story, because otherwise there are no boys born. You only have a birth if you have a mother. And so I want you to, but she conceived and bore a son, and he, notice the shift to the third masculine singular here, and he called his name Er. To err is human. No, but anyway, and so we can say, and that, notice, and jumping back again, it's very interesting. Quite often in a story, you'll hear about women calling the son, but here it's the man, and it's like Moses, in telling this story, wants to keep our focus on Judah. It's about Judah and how his tribe is established and survives his foolishness. Okay. And then we have again, Wataher od waiteled ben. And she, not there. And she conceived again and bore a son. And he called his name Onan. Now we have a very interesting construction in Hebrew. And it's a feminine again, third feminine singular. Waitosef, this is from the verb yasaf, to add. Od waiteled ben. And she added again and bore a son. Now this construction, she added again, is a way of saying, she did it once, and then she said, and then she did it again. Od. Now I have it a third time, and we're going to make sure it's clear. So it says, so she says something like, and once again, she bore a son. And notice the change. And this is very fascinating to me. So you're stuck with it, the fact that I've got to point it out. Waitikra et shemo shelah. Now, what's different? Why, pardon me, I had, where does it appear? First one was, I should have pointed out earlier. And this, and she called his name Onan, where is it? And he called his name and she called the second one's name Onan, and she called the third one's name Shelah. And it's interesting, somehow or other, is set aside as somehow more significant, at least to Judah. Because he named Judah, but she named the other two. As I said, that's rather common for the woman to name the child, and in the scripture to record it that way. The woman called the name of the child. And I'm sure that it wasn't something just arbitrarily did, but I think we got to say the author is saying is different. And the reason is he's going to be an important part of the story. And then we have another. Here we had this. And now I have this. And here in verse 7 we'll have this again. All right, here we go. Wahaya Bik Ziv Balid Taha Oto. And ordinarily, wahaya is he will be. But in this case, I don't. Bik Ziv. What's Kaziv? Kaziv. I think I gave it to you on your assignment sheet, didn't I? Kaziv, this is verse 5. Bik Ziv, yeah. At Kaziv. And he was at Kaziv when he was born, when Shelah was born. And he has to be Judah. It's interesting, it's the woman who's been involved everywhere. Like he called his name and then she conceived, and she gave birth, and she called, and she again gave birth, and she called, and he was. And I think we almost had to say, but, and this may explain this, he wasn't living with her. He'd moved on. He'd left her behind at Kaziv, and he went over to Kaziv when she gave birth to him. She bore him. At her bearing of him is sort of the idea we're saying here. This is the direct object marker, and here is the subject, and this is a temporal personal pronoun, temporal infinitive construct indicating simultaneous action, overlapping action. And the haya disrupt, the big point here is this breaks the flow. And it breaks the flow in it because, as I said, quite often what haya is the introduction to future tense, to a future time, and it doesn't work here at all. And so the reader has to go, wait a minute, I sort of thought this might be going predicting something, but it isn't. So this is disruption. And so it's like, oh. And we say, there's some significance to the fact, as far as Moses is concerned, that he wasn't there. That maybe their relationship wasn't all it was cracked up to be, or something about that. Anyway, just to make sure we don't lose track of the subject, the topic, he's reintroduced here. Vayikach Yehuda Isha La'er Ba Koro. And Judah took a wife for Bakoro. You know what Bakor is? You put it there, yeah.
His firstborn.
It's his firstborn, yeah. And that helps me understand why Jacob was the one that named him. Is the firstborn. That's the important one. And this is interesting. He is now, that said nothing about the woman. And it says, and he took a name for his firstborn. Ushmah Tamar. And her name was Tamar. Now the woman matters. His wife is not important to the story, but Tamar, his daughter-in-law, is. And he's already hinted at that by simply not naming the wife. Even though she does, she's busy having babies and naming them over and over several verses or for several sentences, but she doesn't get. And now he picks a wife, presumably at Kaziv. He picks. He gets a wife for his firstborn, and then Waihi. Now, what Waihi does is it resets. It often is the start of a new paragraph or a new section or something, but not because it means new section. It means, all right, I'm resetting the basic facts here. All right, the basic facts here was about that time. And now the basic fact here is the firstborn of Judah. Let's see. Wahi bakor Yehuda rak ba'enai Adonai. And the firstborn of Judah, was bad in the eyes of Yahweh. And this is a new phase. We're restarting here. And it's interesting. I know that because we have I also notice I have unnecessary detail here. I don't need to know. I already know that he is the firstborn of Judah. I was just told that. His firstborn. And his firstborn, was bad in the eyes of Yahweh. So we have a contrast here. Daddy is happy as he can be. He's got a bride for his boy. But God is not pleased with the boy. And there is a consequence, but it's a sequence here. He was evil, and that's a state. This is establishing a situation. If we're starting a new phase in the story, and the setting is you got a bad boy, an evil boy. We're not told what it is that was displeasing about him. We just know God's not happy with this guy at all. And then we see, and then that leads to this consequence. Wayamitehu Adonai. And Yahweh killed him. And notice, I have Yahweh repeated when I don't need to. He did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and he killed him. And in the context, it isn't really, there's not very it's very difficult to believe that, Er's not going to kill himself, and Judah is not going to kill him. So we have figured out if he's done evil in the eyes of Yahweh and he killed him, we would say it was Yahweh who killed him. But we have Yahweh repeated. Right? He wants to make this very clear. So there's no question. This death is not random. It is not incidental. This is God's judicial act against Er. And that becomes significant because it sets the stage for what's coming next. And now we have a statement here. Wayomer Yehuda le Onan, and we have a quotation. I'll start this way. Here we go. Boel eshet ahicha vayabem otaha bayotim ataha wa hakem zera la ahicha. All right. Let's translate. All right. And Judah said to Onan, there's the end of the quote, by the way. Jacob said to Onan, Go in unto Ashet. Remember I told you, Bo-el means to have sex with, which would mean, in this case, marriage. Go have sex with the wife of your brother. And this is not a vav consecutive. Notice. This is a vav, a simple vav attached to a future, to an imperfect. And go into her and Yavim Otaha. All right. This is what, verse 8? Yeah. I think Yavim. The imperative. Yeah, consummate the marriage. Okay, that's why I'm having trouble. It's not a common word. There is a way of saying that more directly in English, but it's dirty, so we're not going to say it, okay? As is often the case with words describing sexual activity, most of the time, any active verb in English that deals with sexual activity is generally dirty and almost always talks about somehow oppression, a man forcing himself. So it's kind of a tragic thing about our language that we have. There's probably something historically which is bad. Now we have, I make love to my wife. That's different. But the other words that talk directly about having sex would be questionable. But that's the idea here. Consummate the marriage. So go in unto her and consummate the marriage with her. And that's where I have to translate. This is not with, this is a direct object, but and raise up, the Hifil here, and again, I'm putting double underlines here for a reason. And raise up a seed to your brother. And the reason is because these three verbs, this is your basic verb, it's imperative, and this is a P. I'm trying to think, I said it was in, is that a, it's also an imperative. I was thinking it was not, but looking at it, I realized it was, yeah. So I have an imperative, an imperative, and an imperative. A cow imperative, a PL imperative, and a Hifil imperative. A little review on your forms here. And but what are they saying? He says, go and consummate and raise up. So these are, and this is certainly expressing a sequence of events with this being the result. But this is, because it's imperative, we can say, this is behavioral discourse. This is hortatory. He's giving instructions, he's giving orders to his son. Why ya that? And you go, hey, why ya that? And there it is, a vowel consecutive again. So now we're back. Why ya that? And we have to say, who knew? And he knew. Who knew? Onan knew. And what he knew? That Kilolo, I love that. Yigeh Hazerah. And he knew that not to him would be the seed. The seed would not be his. He would have a child, but it wouldn't be considered his child. Just like Ruth. Then you have that's what he said. Raise up a seed to your brother. That is, when the child is born, he will be considered your brother's child. And he will inherit your brother's share of everything. So you're going to help. When your brother died, he went from having to get 1/3. Well, here's the way it works, by the way. This might help explain what's going on here with Onan. The normal pattern was this. The oldest brother, the firstborn, got a double portion of the inheritance. So there are 3 boys. That would mean that was going to get 1/2, and each of his brothers was going to get 1/4 of the inheritance when his father Judah died. Then dies, and Onan becomes the eldest. he's going to get a double portion. That's going to mean he gets 2/3. And his brother gets 1/3. And then dad says, no, raise up a seed and go back to getting a quarter. And he goes, wait a minute, Dad. He doesn't argue with his father because his dad always has the right to disinherit him. This is not a law. He has to get that. But this is normal procedure. And so he says he knew that, and Onan knew that the seed would not be his. And now, here we go again. A verb that doesn't have action. So we're interrupting. Vahaya im ba, and that's a perfect. I'll do it that way so we get. Im ba el eshet ahiu. Wa shichet atsa. Labilti natan zerah la ahi. That's a long sentence, but let's take a look at this. And it was, and it would be, because this is, I said, usually the wahaya gives us the future. In this case, it's not future time. It is continuing pattern. And it would be, if he entered unto her, we would say in English, smooth this out, whenever he would have sex with her, with the wife of his brother, that's what it says, he would spill on the ground. I'm not going to explain that. I'll just say it is a birth control mechanism that could be practiced that involved the Latin, coitus interruptus. He would complete, but not complete it in such a way that she could be pregnant. And so he would spill on the ground in order not to give a seed to his brother. Now we have a very specific point. We don't know what it is that God did not like about Er, but we have absolute clarity about what God did not like about Onan. Onan was selfish and deceptive. He pretended to be going along with his father's wishes while he was actively trying to thwart them. And he did so in such a way that it wasn't like he just set her aside and left her alone. He did everything except have babies by her.
Mr. Williamson,
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the verbs.
Okay.
So how, and maybe I was gone this lesson because I had basketball.
Okay.
So how do you tell the difference between an imperative and a verb consecutive? Because they kind of look the same to me.
First of all, verb consecutive always has an imperfect prefix.
Right.
So this form, for example, hey, there's no imperfect that starts with hey.
Okay.
The one place, and this is where I got confused, but notice the vav here, and, well, there are the two. A vav consecutive always has the pattern, and it'll be yod, or tau, or nun, or aleph, and if it's aleph, this will be a kametz, and no dagesh. But you have this pattern. And what we have here is what? A simple vav.
Okay.
There's the vav consecutive. Always has the patak. And normally has the dagesh, except with Waihi, they got rid of that there, but that's it. So I'm looking. Okay, I don't have the patak. Don't have an A-class vowel under it, and it's pre-C, and in this case, in this case, it's not the verb that follows it doesn't begin with an yod, tau, nun, or aleph, so it can't be verb consecutive. And then I know it's not a vowel consecutive even here because I have schwa, not patok underneath. Okay?
So
Go ahead.
what if it doesn't have the vav? Because there's no and.
Then it's not a vowel consecutive.
Then I guess what's the difference in conjugation for an imperative? Is it the same as something?
Okay, let's take a minute. I think I got a black marker here. Let's see if it's got enough on. Okay, we're good. Oh, I got another one here. Maybe which one's juicier? There we go. I knew I'd have a good one here. All right. Yes. All right. Let's take the vowel consecutive. Looks like an imperfect most of the time. So let's take the verb katal, which is our old friend here. I thought that would be darker, and it turns out it isn't. All right, well, let's see what happens here. And I have frustration. Let's try this now. Maybe I got the wrong one there. Yick. Toe. And actually, since we're going to be making an imperative out of it, let's make it tick-toe. Which would be, the imperfect would be, and we'll pretend it's future tense, she will kill. All right. Or you will kill, certainly. Let's make it second person since we're going to mimic it in an imperative. Now, to make it vowel consecutive, I would simply make it and that would be and you killed consecutive following in a contingent sequence. And then this happened, and then you killed. If I want to make it an imperative, I'm going to get rid of that before I scrape up the board more than I have to. I simply take it and go this way. It has the vowel pattern of the imperfect without the prefix and the prefix vowel.
Okay.
And there's katol. And if it was the second that's masculine singular, second masculine, it's feminine singular, then we say, okay, katol, katoli would be our, because it would be yik, tiktoli becomes katoli. Oh, pardon me. It would be like this, katoli, but we can't have two vocal things, so we make it kitli. And then for the masculine plural, we know that it's going to be ta again on the front. Let's put it in there. The tick. Pardon me. Tick till blue. And again, we just erase get rid of the prefix and adjust to make it pronounceable, and we get kitlu, and then we have tiktona, and lo and behold, katolna. And there are your imperatives. So they're related to the imperfect, but they're distinctive from it. What makes this one tricky, and why I even got sidetracked for a moment, is that looks an awful lot like a vowel consecutive, but I suddenly realized the patok wasn't under the yod. It was, and the dog, and there was no dogish in the under the vav. It was under the yod, and there was no dogish in the yod. And I go, oh, that's a verb that begins. That's the verb yavein. And all right.
That makes sense.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. I'll go with green again. Vayera be'enai Adonai asher asa. Okay. And here I'll do it this way. It's a relative clause which is being used as a direct object. It's a relative clause being used as a noun clause, as the direct object of vayera. This is the verb hifil of the verb ra'ah, which means, or ra'ah, I should say, which means to, in the cal, would mean to be evil. This is to consider evil, consider bad. And it was considered bad in the eyes of Yahweh. What was? That which he had done. The use of the perfect here in the clause places the action before the action of that verb before the action of this verb. Which makes sense. God wasn't reacting to what was going to happen, he reacted to what had happened. And then we have the Vav consecutive again. And he, and of course, and he killed him also. And it's interesting, we don't have Yahweh again. We don't have to have Yahweh here because we already had Yahweh up here. See, up here we had the same sort of thing. Where was it?
Before mostly.
Yeah, up here. And he was evil, and the firstborn, and heir the firstborn of Judah was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and Yahweh killed him. And now he says, and he killed him also. Down there. And if so we can see, okay, our major, before I go to the next slide, let's look and see what we can see here. All right. We know we have to start with Wahi there. And we come all the way down through here, and we're looking to see, okay, where's the division here? And everything builds and builds and builds. We have the birth of the three sons. And then we have another Wahi. No, that's, we have the, yes, that's it. There's our major division. And it was at that time, and heir the firstborn of it was. This is first phase. Judah getting married. Now, you might, getting married and having the sons, and getting us a wife for his son, his firstborn. That introduces the important character that we need. Because it turns out that none of Judah's sons are going to matter. They die, two of them die off, and one of them just disappears from the story and is never heard from again. Even the book of Chronicles never mentions him. First Chronicles never mentions it. But Tamar is not only mentioned here, and in First Chronicles, she's also mentioned in the New Testament, in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so you say, okay, she's going to matter. In fact, the whole story basically is focused on what she did as opposed to what Judah did. And now we have to continue the story. We're still setting it up and getting things set up. We have Tamar, and then we have to say, we got another, one boy dies, and another boy dies. Okay, let's we got into verse 10, right? Let's go to verse 11. This does not, the mark here that indicates we're starting a new phase of the story is the return of the subject Yehuda. I mean, we've had two boys die, and now Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, and now, notice, Shavi. This is the this is the feminine singular, or if you want, second feminine singular imperative of the verb yeshav, which means to dwell or sit, and in this case it would be remain. And I have it broken here because if you were looking, when you look in your Bible, this is where it breaks on the page. And then you go over here. Almanah, the A on the end, this is Alma. Alman is a trying to remember, Almanah. I didn't put it there, okay. Alma. Remain a widow. That's what it was. Anyway, something here got it wrong. All right. I kept wanting to say mother-in-law, and I knew that wasn't right. Said to her, and Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in the house of your father until Shelah is grown, becomes big. Yigdal. Shelah, my son, is big. And then, this is kind of an interesting one, so I'm going to put it here in a different break here. This is what he told her, and this is what he thought. This is the real motive behind what he said. This, in other words, the key here is not explaining why she should stay with her, stay with her father. Let me start with that. The house of your father. That was not normally where a widow would stay. In ancient Israel, unlike in modern America, and much of the world, I suspect, when a man died, his widow was still part of his family. When she, in a very real sense, when a woman married, her family adopted her. That is, her husband's family adopted her. So she was considered Judah's daughter. And she was Judah's responsibility, and she was under Judah's authority. And so Judah sends her back away from his other son to live with her father, and undoubtedly had to pay the father to take his daughter back and take care of her while she's waiting for the youngest son to marry her. And then he says, because, and you have to see there are two ways that that we use in English and in Hebrew use the idea of a cause. It can be the reason he said this. He said this because, but he said this because he said. And that means no, this isn't why she should remain a widow. This is why he told her to remain a widow. Because he said to himself, lest he also die like his brothers. In other words, he's got it all figured out. My boys are fine. It's that dirty Tamar that's getting them killed. She's bad luck. She's a curse. And of course, this sets up the whole stage. Is the problem? We have already been told the problem's not Tamar. The problem is Judah's own sons. They were perverse, unacceptable to the Lord. We don't know the specific nature of the sin or sinful behavior that led to Er's death, but Er did something bad enough that God wiped him out, took him off the planet. And we know what his brother did, and that was enough to have God take him out too. And so now he says, wow, I'm afraid my other son will die if she marries him. Waitelek Tamar, and this is our verb halak, to go. And Tamar went and dwelt in the house of her father. Now that's setting up the stage for the next part of the story. And now we have to move through time. Ravav. There's our verb, ravav, right here. Why yirbu, or rabah, I guess it is, which means to increase. Why yirbu hayamim, why tamat batshua eshet Yehuda. And this is, of course, a disruption. Even though it's about consecutive, it's now not talking about what Judah did or what Tamar did. It's talking about what the days did. And time passed, that's basically paraphrase here, and time passed, and the wife of the daughter of Shua, the wife of Judah, died. Again, no name. The name, her father. The daughter of Shua, the wife of Judah, died. Why Yenahem, Jehuda, there is Judah again. And Nacham, that's to comfort. But notice, it's a nifal. And Judah was comforted. And that's a state, not an action. She died and Judah's comforted, so we're setting the stage. All of this is setting the stage for the next phase. So this is phase one. She goes and lives with her father. He tells her to, because he's got a false idea of what's going on. And she does what he tells her to do. And then his wife dies, which means he's not going to have any more children. And so he's stuck with one son, Onan. And if Onan, everything is hanging on Onan if there's going to be a future for the tribe of Judah. And he's comforted, that is, he went through the period of grieving, appropriate period of grieving for his wife. And now we're ready. Why Ya'al al Gozai Sono Hu Wa Hira Re'ehu Ha-Adulumi Timnatha. Okay. And he arose, or he went up, I should say, unto Gozi, unto the shearing of his flock, the sheep, he and Hira, his friend, the Adulamite. And where'd they go? To Timnah. Yeah. Timnatha, and there's the on the end is to Timnah. Why Yugad Latamar Lemor, and it was told. This is the verb nagad, and it is in the passive, the pual here. And it was polal, I guess. Hathal, I believe. And it was told to Tamar, saying, look, Hamich, your father-in-law, Ole, is going up Timnatha, to Timnah, Lagoz Zono, to shear his flock. And again, setting the stage now. We've passed through time, And what's happening? Yeah. Here's our starting point after these days, and now now she knows what's happening. And notice, watch for the feminine verbs from this point on. Judah does some stuff, but most of it is in response to her. Wataser bigdei amanutha me'aleha watikas bat sa'if watith alaf. There you go. And she took off the garments of her widowhood from on her. Whoops, get it here. And she put on a wrap. I don't know what did I put in your notes here. Did I put it in there? This is verse 14. Yeah, a shawl, a wrap. Okay, that's the best I can do. Put on. In other words, she's not wearing normal clothes. She's wearing something that could easily just open up, and there she is in all her glory. And she put on a wrap. By Tith Alaf, by Teshav, but Petach Einayim, Asher Al Derek Timnatha. Well, sit there. Notice Titha. She's doing something to herself. The Hith Pa'el. Do you see that? Tith Alaf. So we said the verb is Alaf, and she's going to Alaf herself. And I think I gave it to you there, Tith Alaf, didn't I? Yeah. She's wrapping herself up. In the wrap, of course. And so she wraps herself up in the wrap, and she sits at the opening to the springs. Could be eyes, but it's almost certainly springs here. At the opening of the springs, that would be the road leading to the springs along the road. Or, if you want, Einayim, I think it's the name of a town here, in this case. Think of it, Einayim, yeah. But it literally means the two springs. And so she sat at the opening, that is the way to Einayim. It wouldn't be the gate of the city. There's a technical word for that. This is the opening to, that would be the pass or the gap along the road that leads off to Einayim. And she sits there to Einayim, which is on the road to Timnah. And why did she do that? Because Ra'atha, because she saw Ki Gadal Shelah, that Shelah had grown up, Wahi Lo Nitana Lo, and she had not been given to him. Notice, perfect tense. So it's true. He grew up, and I was not given to him, like I was telling you, as a wife. Vayir'eh Yehudah, and Judah saw, Yak Shabeha La Zonaha Ki Kistaha Paneha. And Judah saw her, ha, on the end. Judah saw her, and he thought that he considered her to be a prostitute because she covered her face. She had a wrap around and she put a veil on her face. And that's the thing. In the ancient world, married women and single women wore no veil. Prostitutes wore a veil. And they didn't take the veil off when you made love to them. When men made love to them. And the reason was they were selling their body, they weren't selling a relationship. So you can have the sex, but we're nobody. I'm just a thing. I'm selling myself as a thing. And she takes advantage of that. So Judah is the reason why Judah doesn't know who she is, because he's not paying, first of all, he's not paying very much attention. He hasn't got a wife to satisfy his sexual desire, so he's vulnerable to sexual temptation, more vulnerable to temptation than he might have been before. And now he sees this woman who's clearly got a wrap on, which is very easily removed, and she's wearing a veil, presenting herself as a prostitute, so, okay. And that's what a perfect place to stop. Don't you wish we really could go through the next half of Genesis? Oh, well, we'll just like now, here's your assignment for next week as far as your translate. Two things. Number one, you might have noticed I call something called blind reading. Here's a blind reading. Just these are all very short. I encourage you as much as possible. I gave you the reference, so I'm cheating a little bit here. I won't always, but I encourage you before you check out the text, the English translation or the Chinese, the Mandarin, Chinese would work because the same text is for several languages, yes. But anyway, translation, try to figure it out on your own. It's only 2 verses long, and I give you some translation helps down at the bottom. And I also explain the textual question here, just so you'll know how textual criticism works. It isn't going to affect your translation because I'm rejecting that alternative interpretation. And then don't forget the reading question. I will post this. I haven't got it set up yet, but I will post it online. You can send in your translation and your answers as a text file. But I want you to start translating what we'll be reading next, which is Exodus chapter 21. And in this case, you're going to want to analyze as you go. Exodus 21 is obviously not narrative. It is clearly a legal section. He just says, if this happens, do this, and if this happens, do that. And just get a sense of how it unfolds and be sensitive to the structure. One of the things I want you to watch for is how much you can figure out if you just pay attention. And that's true in vocabulary when you're translating. Once you get into context, you start saying, I know what to expect, so I think this verb is going to be about something like this, or this noun has to be related to that. And it's amazing how often you'll be right, or at least close enough to right, that you will be more likely to remember it the next time. I will also post a vocabulary exercise for you, but I haven't got that up there yet. And if I don't get up in time, you guys get off the hook. I won't post it at the last second and say I want it due by tomorrow afternoon. So we'll see you next week anyway.
How about the textbook reading?
The what? Oh, the textbook reading. Yeah, go ahead and start reading. Read the section on narrative, and let's leave the the grammar alone for the moment. Read the section on narrative and the section on legal literature. That's a rather lengthy combination, but just become familiar with it because these guys are trying to help you. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.